This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Duke University professor Norman Wirzba takes your questions about food and faith. Wirzba is a research professor of theology, ecology, and rural life at the Duke Divinity School. His forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press is Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating. He is also the editor of The Gift of Creation, Images from Scripture and Earth. In The Gift of Creation, Wirzba collaborated with photographer Thomas Barnes to publish a collection of photographs and essays exploring the relationship between the Bible and the earth. To ask Professor Wirzba a question, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. Tell us what you think. Fill out the brief survey on the Duke Office Hours website. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and I am here with Professor Norman Wirzba from the Duke Divinity School. Professor Wirzba, thanks for coming in to hold office hours.
Thanks for having me.
Good. So in talking about food and faith, you make a distinction between the physical act of chewing and digesting food and what you would call really eating.
Right.
So what's this difference between just chewing and actually eating?
One of the quotes that I love is from a Cambridge dean named Ralph Inge, who said once that all of nature is a conjugation of the verb to eat. And I think it's wonderful because it describes how all living things need to eat to survive and to live. And the key, of course, is that human beings don't just eat to live. We also eat to do a lot else, which includes to live together in particular sorts of ways, that through our eating we can express values about what we think is important, that we can participate in sharing of food with each other, create community, right? We can teach our young how to be adults by the eating that we do together. So eating isn't simply a physiological act like it might be for a lot of other creatures, but eating is also this way that we become human. And then we can talk about the specific types of humans we want to become, but eating usually plays a pretty important role in that process.
So in talking about, fully eating, you came across a painting that you felt really expressed this. So let's go ahead and take a look at that painting. It's called Psalm 85, and the artist is John August Swanson. So I noticed no one's actually having anything in their mouth in this painting, but yet you say it speaks to eating.
Yeah, what I liked about the painting is that it describes, I think in a really wonderful way, how eating is an embedded activity, that food is tied directly to all sorts of biophysical, ecological processes. And so in the painting you see light prominently displayed, you see fields and you see trees and vegetation, and you also see people working in these fields, and you see that there's fruit in the tree, and there's this coming together of the social and the ecological or the agricultural, which I think is important because so much of the eating that happens in our culture today tends to happen with food as a product or a commodity, which has been abstracted out of this ecological context and then also out of a social context when you think about how much eating that we do tends to happen alone or on the run, going through a drive-through, something like that. And so what a painting like that does, I think, is it shows how eating is deeply embedding if we decide to make it such, and that it connects us to ecological realities, agricultural, social, cultural realities too.
So let's speak concretely here. When you sit down at your breakfast table, I mean, what's your prayer? What are you eating? What are the reflections you have?
Yeah. Well, in the mornings it's a little harder because you've just woken up and you sort of have a routine that involves getting kids ready for school. So in my house, usually what I do is I get up a little earlier than the kids, so I have a bowl of cereal for breakfast. And then when the kids come down, I'll usually make them something. My older daughter, she's a good baker and cook, so she will sometimes bake muffins. And the point is, at this early stage, just to make sure that they've got good food in their bodies, because so many of the breakfast choices that are for sale in stores are really bad for kids. They are very sugary, for instance, and that's not a good way to start the day. So we try to have good, healthy food in the beginning of the day. And then during the day, of course, you try then to complement that with other good food choices. And it's tricky because some kids are very receptive to eating good, healthy food, lots of fruits and vegetables. And with others, it's very hard to do. And so as a parent, you have to figure out how you negotiate that and how you try to be fairly merciful about eating too. Because, I mean, what I have found as I talk about eating, as I've thought about eating and researched it, is that food communicates a lot in our society. And it's deeply emotional for many people. And so you can't simply go after people because you think they're eating something that maybe isn't the best for them, because there's all kinds of reasons why people eat the way that they do. And to get people to change their eating habits is also difficult. And you have to be patient, you have to be merciful. And so when I teach this sort of stuff to students, I often say, let's not be too hard on each other. Let's not be the food police, because that can be, destructive rather than helpful. And I think one of the important things about the sociality of eating together is that we be a help to each other rather than to be a problem to each other. Because I think eating is so important for the way we live into the world, and the eating choices we make will say a lot about the kind of world we actually live in.
And you're talking about complete, wholly, healthy eating, but that implies that there's sinful eating.
Sure.
I mean, some people think, eating 3 Klondike bars in one sitting, and that's
right.
But how would you describe sinful or disordered eating?
Yeah, I mean, there are several dimensions to this. If you expand our discussion about food to start with agricultural realities, some of the disorder in our eating or the malfunction in our eating starts with the way we grow and raise our food. Mm-hmm. So many of our industrial agricultural practices depend upon soil erosion, water depletion, water poisoning. We're doing a lot to our lands, our fields, and our waters that are very destructive. And when you have soil that's been compromised because it's been so heavily laced with poisons or herbicides or then fossil fuel-derived fertilizers, the microorganismic structure within that soil is compromised, and the food that comes out of it tends to be compromised too. Its full nutritional and health qualities is lacking. And so Sir Albert Howard, one of the founders of modern organic farming, wrote a book called Soil and Health, in which he showed that the basis for good, healthy eating depends upon good, healthy soil. And so that has to be the beginning. That's where the disorder starts for many people. But then if you take it on up, when you think about how so much of our food is very highly processed, has many artificial ingredients that we know are destructive or dangerous for human health, that can be a form of eating which also creates many, many problems for us physiologically. And that's not good. And then there's also sort of the social dimension beyond the physiological. When you have a lot of people who are eating alone and they eat as a way to work out some of their own troubles or their own anxieties, or when you have eating disorders that we do in our society.
Right.
Those are things that are also serious problems. And so having a conversation about food, trying to be together as we eat, I think can be a way to address some of these concerns.
So let's bring some viewer questions in, and everyone watching is invited to participate in this office hours session. Professor Norman Wirzba is talking about food and faith. So E.J. Turnbull has tweeted in, who asks, with all the support given to sustainable movements, is there a risk in the church to begin worshiping food by giving it too much importance? So you've been saying how important food is, but is it possible to...
Oh, sure. I think that's possible because the thing about food is not that it's worthy of our worship, but it's worthy of our care, right? And that's an important difference because the first thing you recognize when you're involved in food production, and if you're paying attention to the eating that you do, for you to eat something, it has to be killed first. And so the source of the life of the food that you need to live yourself is not in the food itself, right? It comes from beyond itself. And as a Christian, the way I would talk about that is to say that the source of life is always God, who is the giver of the gift of life and food. And so that's where our attention needs to be. And I think activities like saying grace are very important because they help contextualize the eating that we do. But I would say that's a worry that is going to affect a very small number of church folk, because for many church people that I know, getting food on the radar is the real challenge. Many people don't think that this is a theological concern. And so many church people are eating in ways that are destructive of creation.
And when you talk about context in your writing, the Eucharist, communion, Christian communion is
Right.
very important. Could you set that up?
Yeah, I think the Eucharist, at least within a Christian tradition, is so important because what I say in the book is that this is where we learn table manners, how we live together while we eat. And the Eucharist is that place in Christian life where we eat and drink Jesus, so to speak, so that Christ can live within us, so that we can then live in the world in ways that reflect what he thinks is important. And when we see that Jesus' ministry was so much about the ministry of healing and feeding and reconciling people, that this then becomes part of what we are supposed to do through our eating. We can eat in ways that honor creatures, that take care of creatures, just as we can eat in ways that are a desecration. And so having the regular opportunity, as the Eucharist can be, for us to be able to reflect about how our living in the world is changed because Christ now abides in us, that can be an occasion to start to think differently about eating practices.
Good. We've got a number of questions that have come in, so let's take them here. Kathy sent a question by email. Would love for you to talk about animals and meat sacrifice. Also, do you have any recommendations for how non-Christians can think about eating spiritually and mystically?
Okay, well, yeah, the topic of sacrifice and meat is a very, very complicated one. I think a way to start is there's a sociologist of religion, anthropologist of religion named Jonathan Smith, who said once that as far as the record goes, historically speaking, the only animals that are ever sacrificed are domestic animals. That means agricultural livestock. And I think that's significant because it says that if you're going to eat meat, it has to be meat that has been raised by you, that has been cared for by you. And if you look at the Hebrew scriptures, it's very clear that you are not supposed to bring the animal that was going to die anyway to sacrifice. You're supposed to bring a healthy animal without blemish. And if you're a shepherd, that's significant because the animal that is fully healthy is your breeding stock. It's your livelihood. And so to sacrifice something like that sort of an animal means that you're giving yourself as well as the animal. And I think this is what sacrifice is really important for, because we tend to focus on sacrifice and think that there's this killing of an animal, which we find repulsive. But larger happenings are going on here, including the life of self-offering of the shepherd who has given so many hours to make sure this animal is healthy and well. And so I would say that for people who want to eat meat today, I think the meat to be eaten is the kind that has been raised responsibly, very carefully, in a way that shows love and concern for them. And so we don't have as much meat like that in our grocery stores because a lot of it is factory raised, and that's pretty awful for animals. And so I would suggest as much as possible we stay away from that kind of meat. Now, as the second part of the question, I think, was about how
non-Christians can think about eating spiritually and mystically.
Right. I mean, I think what we will find when you start looking at other faith traditions, there's a great deal of interest and attention given to food.
Eating kosher seems to jump out.
Oh, sure. I mean, when you think Judaism, you think kosher dietary laws, which again have much of this built into them about the kind of practices, the kindnesses that you are supposed to show to the animals if you eat the animals, and also how you raise and how you cook the food, right? It's very important. And if you think of Islam, you think of Ramadan, and you don't eat from sun up to sundown, and then when you do eat in the evening, that it's this time for the sharing of food, which again communicates something very valuable about how food is not just fuel that we eat, but it's a way to live into our living with other creatures and other people. And of course, Hindus have the tradition of Gandhi, who talked very much about the importance of compassion and living in the world gently and non-violently. And that has tremendous implications, I think, for eating practices. So I think you can see that across the world's faith traditions, there's a great deal of interest, but it's not being tapped very much of the time because the industrial food system has presented itself as such a cheap and attractive way to eat, even though when you dig a little deeper behind what's going on in this industrial system, what we find would not be honoring of many of the faith traditions.
It seems that there is some interfaith tension. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of Christians and Jews. I mean, that was a big
Sure.
point of contention is clean and unclean foods.
Right.
And so there's not only agreement.
Oh, you're right, sure. And I don't know that agreement should be the most important thing. I think healthy conversation where we can learn from each other while being true to what we understand about what we should do in this regard, I think is really important. There's a group I just learned of in England called the Alliance for Religion and Conservation that is starting a major initiative on food and faith, which is very encouraging because the key insight driving this project is that most of the world's faith traditions have an interest in food. Many of these faith traditions have many millions, billions even of members. So what if the faith traditions were to say that let's encourage the people in our tradition to eat in ways that honor the tradition? That could have tremendous effect in terms of how we will grow our food, which will have tremendous ecological implications. Right? We will help heal our soils. We will help with water quality, right? As well as producing health in the bodies of the people who eat, health in the animals that we often eat. So I think having the world's faith traditions in the conversation and modeling practices for the world is really encouraging.
Great. We've got a few more questions here from viewers, and everyone watching is invited to participate in this office hours conversation. Professor Norman Wirzba, we're talking about food and faith. This question has come in here by email from Sarah, who says, food connects us to creation and to incarnation, capital I, and also to issues of justice and stewardship. One of the justice issues that we're wrestling with in my congregation is how industrialized agricultural systems limits the economic choices for many of us. It can be a lot more expensive to buy a locally grown head of broccoli than a six-pack of Coke, for instance. The question is, how can a community of faith begin to challenge this system?
Right. Yeah, and that's a really good question because when we are reduced to being food consumers, we think that we have to buy all of our food, and then we're stuck with whatever choices are available. Do you go to Food Lion or do you go to Whole Foods? And many people who are strapped for money will say, well, I can't go to Whole Foods, and that's a legitimate concern. And so I think this is where churches can play a very important role because many churches are housed on significant pieces of land. Sometimes that land is being used for nothing more than a lawn, which requires pesticides and requires manicuring and a lot of fossil fuel energy. What if churches were to decide that we will start growing food? Many churches have people that have experience gardening. I think it would be fantastic for churches to become involved in the food growing business, in the feeding business. I mean, they have the model of Jesus, after all, who spoke in all this horticultural imagery. So I think if churches were to say, we're going to start growing food seriously to help those people who do not have the income to purchase the food that would be better for us, I think that would be fantastic. It would also be a wonderful way to do spiritual formation. It would bring people together working in a garden, older people who are looking for the skills that older generations have would be taught by them. There could be all sorts of good work done around how to preserve food that has been grown in a sustainable way. So what I'm hoping that people will start to see is that the options are not simply buying at this store or buying at that store, but that we can start to grow food together. And more churches are doing that, and I think it's a very encouraging development.
All right, next question. Jeff asks, agriculture involves questions of value and therefore moral choice. So what level or whose experience do you think we should use as our standard for determining our values, micro or macro? I assume he's talking economics there. Individual versus group, most goods, least carbon footprint. So some economic models, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question, too, because agriculture has very diverse expressions depending on where you are in the world and then obviously also in this country. And I think what's important when trying to develop economic models for thinking about agriculture, that we be very careful about how we can be attentive to the land, that we can be attentive to the animals, and attentive to the eaters of the produce that comes from the fields. And so one of the encouraging things that I'm seeing now is the development of local food systems. Right now, many of us eat in an immense cloud of ignorance. We don't know where our food comes from. We don't know under what conditions it was produced.
Right.
And as a result, we can't advocate for just food production practices. We have this sort of vague understanding that the strawberries that look really good, may have been picked by workers who do not have any benefits, who are perhaps even in near slave conditions, right? And that's a major concern. And we need to be thinking about why our food is so cheap. Who's paying the price? Because somebody's paying the price. So with a local food economy, what you have is greater accountability built into it. Food doesn't sit in a truck for a month. It's picked when it's ripe, and it's eaten close to ripeness rather than being ripened artificially. It's not necessarily going to be sprayed with all of these chemicals that preserve the food, make it look nice. Mm-hmm. And it also increases the possibility that consumers can be involved in the production, right? That relationships between eaters and farmers can happen so that farmers can see what their consumers want, and consumers can be in conversation with the growers to say, this is what we would like. And as consumers, we have a lot of power because we're spending the money on food, and farmers will produce the things that we say we want. And I think that's all to the good, because I want to see agriculture revitalized, not that farmers should have to pay all of the costs that we ourselves don't want to pay.
So for some specifics, take us through the grocery store when you're doing the Wirzba family shopping.
Okay.
I mean, are you looking for local, free-range, organic,
Right.
biodynamic?
Yeah, I mean, the labeling gets really complicated. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of political wrangling over how to label food, and the organic labeling history is a complicated one in this country. We certainly try to find food that is organic, but it's not the only value. Mm-hmm. So for instance, when we buy food, we often go to Weaver Street, where we buy a lot of our food. We try to buy eggs from a person that we know. We try to buy milk that supports a local dairy. The dairy isn't necessarily organic, but we think it's important to support a local business. We try to grow some of our own vegetables. We try to buy vegetables from the region because they're going to be much fresher. And then there's also this very complicated, time-involved process of trying to know something about the companies that are buying or producing, packaging, marketing, things like cereals, things like flour, many of the staples that you're simply going to have to buy. And those aren't all going to be locally produced. And so one of the things I do in a class that I teach on food is I ask students to start each class telling us the history about a food item that they really like. And one of the revealing things about this is how difficult it is for us to really know where our food comes from. What are the conditions under which it's being produced? And so we can find information about some companies that we know are going to be more responsible, that pay their workers a just wage, that provide benefits, that try not to abuse animals, that try not to abuse fields, that try not to use too many preservatives. So a lot of what responsible shopping means is becoming educated about what's in our stores. And this can be a daunting task because we've just taken for granted that if it's in the store, it must be good. And we're learning that it's not necessarily good. And so there's a lot of homework that has to be done.
Good. We've got some more questions
Sure.
here. Some are being tweeted in, and everyone watching is invited to participate in this office hours conversation by email, by Twitter, and by Facebook. So W. Jackson Watts 8 asks, what are the implications of designations such as the food pyramid for this subject of eating faithfully? You're talking a little bit about labels there.
Right. Yeah, the food pyramid has also got an interesting history because, when I grew up, the food pyramid, had its description of, fruits and vegetables, very prominent, fats and sugars, very small part of the piece, right? But a few years ago, Marion Nestle talks about how she was invited to come to the White House to develop a new food pyramid. And the new food pyramid, of course, has strands coming down from the top, communicating that all of them achieve the pinnacle. Mm-hmm. And what you find is that that pyramid took the shape that it did because the lobbies for sugar, the lobbies for beef, were very intense. Wanted to make sure that people didn't think that it's wrong to eat sugars, it's wrong to eat too much red meat. And it's unfortunate that this is how things get worked. We know that there are intense lobbies going on in Washington all the time, well-funded lobbies that really want to make sure that people will buy their product. And the whole conversation about health takes a second seat to the economic question about making sure that businesses get the support they want. All of the scientific understanding that we have on diet says we got to eat more fruits and vegetables. We have to eat less red meat. That's not to say we can't eat any red meat, but we need to eat less of it. We need to eat less sugars, less fats. We know that we have major health problems that are directly related to diet in this country. So it's unfortunate that the food pyramid has become such a politicized symbol because it doesn't do justice to the nation.
Language does seem so important. I mean, is it high fructose corn syrup or is it corn sugar or
Right.
These
Right.
what you call something?
Right, it's very important. And here again, here we have an issue like around high fructose corn syrup. We're growing too much corn in this country. Corn is a crop that is very destructive over the long term because it's a nutrient-hungry plant. And so to keep those fields growing corn year after year after year, we have to keep pumping in all sorts of fertilizers and use a lot of pesticides. And this is a problem because do we need to be growing this much corn? Right? We're growing a lot of it because we're feeding it to cattle. We have found the market now with high fructose corn syrup, and then most recently, the hope that we'll use corn to produce ethanol.
And is that a good idea?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about this too, because to produce ethanol from corn requires you to use a lot of fossil fuel. So we're using fossil fuel to produce fuel. And depending on who you talk to, some say we actually lose total energy by producing ethanol. But if you've got lots of corn being produced, we have to do something with it. And so we're using that corn to produce ethanol. Personally, I don't think it's the wisest way to go, but I know that there will be plenty of people who will disagree with me.
Great. This is Office Hours at Duke University. Professor Norman Wirzba is talking about food and faith. You're invited to join the conversation by email, by Twitter or Facebook. We've got a question here that's come in by Twitter from Andy and Beyond. Says, disappointed by a lack of aesthetics and culture in discussion of theology and food lately. How does this relate to sustainability? Aesthetics and culture.
Aesthetics and culture, yeah, that's interesting. I think the aesthetic dimension is important.
Does it taste good? I mean,
Well, I think, does it taste good, but also how does the food look? And then I think you could back it up even further, is to ask the question, how do the fields look? Or how do the pens in which the animals are raised look? And I think this raises a really important question about how much of our food industry is hidden from us. Right? We live in North Carolina. Lots of pork is produced in this state. Lots of pork is processed in this state. It's very difficult to see what's happening. You're not invited to come onto the farms to see these pork facilities. You're not welcome at Smithfield to just walk through the plant. And there's lots of reasons for that, but I think if people were to see, right, with their own eyes and smell, right, how some of this food is being produced and raised, the aesthetics would turn us off quickly.
we see videos of a slaughterhouse.
Sure. Right. And so there is an aesthetic dimension which I think is very important, right? We want, or at least I would like to see fields that look healthy. I would like to see animals that are contented and happy. Those are important things, those aesthetic dimensions. But I think there's also an aesthetic dimension about how we do our eating, right? When you go through a drive-through, right? You know, you don't have time to look at your food because you're driving while you're eating, right? Or the food comes in a package and the whole sort of sequence of elements that contributed to that package are hidden from view. So think about something like the slow food movement, which advocates that we eat traditionally produced varieties of vegetables and fruits, and that we grow them, that we cook them together, and then we come together around a table and we take time to eat, and we hold up the flavors, we hold up the life that is represented in this eating act. So this slow food movement, I think, is encouraging. I know it's cast as a highbrow elitist movement, but they're not doing anything that grandparents of our generation didn't do, which is to grow your own food, to take pride in heirloom varieties, and to eat food in a celebratory manner. I think those are valuable values that we should keep up.
You just alluded to it there about the slow food and a link with elitism. I mean, I have a little joke with my wife that the farmer's market is a great place to meet white people.
Right.
I mean, it tends to be middle class or people.
Sure.
And so, what about that the connection of class, and does this pertain to urban poor?
Oh, I think so. I think we're seeing our efforts to bring farmers markets into parts of the cities that we call food deserts, right, where there aren't supermarkets. The only kind of food they have access to are the 7-Elevens, the gas stations, which do not have high quality food. Mm-hmm. If they have produce, it tends to be old, leftover, maybe even rotting. Right? So there are efforts now underway to bring farmers markets into these food deserts so people of low income, often minorities, can have access to this food. And interesting, helpful relationships emerge when this happens, because when I was in Kentucky teaching, the Community Farm Alliance, which was a statewide organization, was partnering with farmers to get them into these deserts, food deserts in the mm-hmm. cities. And the people who were buying the food says, we like this kind of a green. Can you grow it? Mm-hmm. And the farmers would say, well, sure, we can grow it. And so partnerships develop between the producers and the consumers, which is exactly what you want to see happen. And here, of course, there are questions about, can we use food stamps for these farmers markets? And there are all sorts of government initiatives that can be helpful here, because existing government initiatives clearly are in the disfavor of people who want to eat responsibly and eat healthy food. So we can adjust some of the way we allocate funding in the government right now to encourage healthier eating, to make food choices available to people who traditionally maybe do not. I think that would be very helpful.
Good. We've got another question here. Jeff has followed up by email, mm-hmm. and everyone watching is invited to participate in this office hours conversation. You can do that by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook. Jeff says, can you comment on Ellen Davis's contention in her book that Scripture supports small farms and intimacy with the land as the most secure foundation for a stable society and sustainable earth? Ellen Davis, of course, your colleague in the Duke Divinity School.
Yeah, Ellen wrote a book called Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, mm-hmm. an agrarian reading of the Bible. It's a marvelous book. Mm-hmm. And I think what she says in the book is right on the money. It's very important what she's describing, because many of us who read Scripture come to it from an urban perspective. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we don't understand much of what's happening in the Bible, because this is a book that's produced by a culture in which small subsistence farmers were the majority. And the kinds of concerns they have are reflected in Scripture frequently. So for instance, in 1 Samuel, you find Samuel talking to the nation as they've just entered the promised land. You don't want to have a king, mm-hmm. because a king will impose upon you, that will exploit your daughters and your sons and your workers. They will exact tribute from your fields. Mm-hmm. And it will make it much harder for subsistence farmers to survive. And when you have a monarchy, you then get the development of classes of people who depend upon, right, the exploitation of fields. Mm-hmm. And what you get then is this sort of suction of the goods produced on the land to these urban centers. Mm-hmm. And the land starts to languish, and the prophets describe this in significant detail. Amos and Micah might be some of the first agrarian writers that we know in the Western world, talking about how a society that depends on one class mm-hmm. exploiting another class and its land is the beginning of ruin. And so, yes, we do need to have farming practices in our culture mm-hmm. that make it possible for the well-being of the land, the well-being of its creatures. And here I think it's interesting that we can learn something from the Amish, okay. right? Because the Amish are folks who have really tried to keep an agricultural tradition alive mm-hmm. that is very much informed by their faith commitments. And when you talk to Amish, they will tell you that you can't have a farm much more than 80 acres and farm it responsibly. Because it's very important that you be able to see the effects of what you're doing. And what we have in a lot of large farm enterprise is a blindness to the destruction that we're causing by doing the farming the way that we're doing it. So to have this understanding of eyes and how much you can see, how much you can take in is very important. And so issues of scale should never be far from our mind, because without that emphasis on being at the right size, we will get too big. And we've made a virtue of bigness, and it's not been good for us.
Now, you yourself grew up on a farm in
Right.
Canada and Alberta. So lessons learned from that, particularly that you could have never learned from a book, but having been raised on a farm.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in southern Alberta, and the farming there was a mixed kind of operation. And I learned a lot from my grandfather, because he was a farmer very much in the mold of animal husbandry. So you take very good care of your animals. Very frugal in his understanding about how you treat fields. You don't waste anything, right? Because the land is precious, and this was his home, and he wanted it to be a healthy, flourishing place, right? And I saw that, and I realized that this is a vision about the world which is gradually being lost, because the farms all around us were becoming industrialized, and you could see what was happening to the fields. You could see what was happening to the wildlife, right, that could have existed in hedgerows and things like this. And this was all disappearing. And you could also see in the farming being done a kind of anxiety and stress. And I think that this was very instructive to me, to see modeled a way of farming that incorporated care and celebration, frugality, and trust in God's provision, rather than trust in your own ability to do everything that you think needs to be done. So that was a very valuable lesson.
Now, you write about narratives, that how we understand, big picture eating and food. And some people might say, well, these bigger farms, that's progress, it's more efficient.
Sure.
So what's the counter-narrative to progress?
Yeah, I think what we have to do when we talk about progress is we have to start talking about accounting. We have grown a lot of food with this industrial method. Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution has increased dramatically the number of bushels we get per acre. But we have to start doing the serious accounting that we've not been doing. So, for instance, recently in the province of Punjab in India, which is the breadbasket for India, it was the birthplace, really, of the Green Revolution in India. The agricultural minister has come out saying we cannot continue to farm this way because we have been drawing down our water. Soil fertility has decreased. We need to go back to traditional methods. So when you start to factor in the costs of what we're doing to soil, what we're doing to water, how we're compromising the ability of us to grow this food in this way for the long term, we realize that the Green Revolution is not sustainable. Right? We might better call it the Brown Revolution, because it depends so much on fossil fuel. It depends so much on vast reserves of water, because irrigation is vital. And there's also this troubling dimension, is that it makes farmers entirely beholden now to seed companies.
Why is that?
Because seeds now become patented, and to grow them you have to pay a licensing fee. You have to continually go back to the seed company. And so traditions in which farmers retained their own seed or shared their own seed with each other, right, those are coming under attack. And we should be concerned, I think, about the monopolization, the consolidation of our food system into the hands of a very small number of very, very powerful international food companies.
When we talk about global narratives, another one I think of is climate change.
Right.
And so, and not all Christians have sort of buy into it or accept it. How would you understand that? Because I think some versions of it are pretty secular in the sense that the earth is in our hands, human hands. We need to do something. So how would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of different ways that you might try to approach it. It would really depend on who the person is that you're speaking to. So if you're dealing with someone who's a climate skeptic, I don't think we need to go the direction of climate at all, because there are so many ways that you can see, just by looking at the land, just by looking at the water, looking at the condition of the animals, that this is not a way to continue to farm. But if you want to try to make the case, then you can clearly talk, I think, about how our industrial food system contributes significantly to greenhouse gases. Right? Estimates vary between 20 to 30% of our greenhouse gases are now directly the result of industrial agricultural practices. So we know that there are serious implications for farming the way that we now do. And so the question would be, is there a different way to farm, a better way to farm? And I was talking recently to Joel Salatin, who has become famous now because he's been in Food Inc. and some other films. But You know, you look at his polyphase farm in Virginia, he's building topsoil, right? He's not using fossil fuel derived herbicides and inputs. So he's actually sequestering carbon with the kind of agriculture that he's doing, all the while producing fantastic meat in, you know, pigs and chickens and turkeys and beef and all of this. And he's actually helping with the greenhouse gas emission problem. He's helping with climate change. And he's doing it by handling animals, farming in a way that is much more sustainable, much more responsible, much more honoring of the lives of these animals and the value of these fields.
You mentioned Food, Inc. There's been a number of these popular books and documentaries, Omnivore's Dilemma, the Barbara Kingsolver book, Fast Food Nation. So are these all helpful? Are some better than others? I mean, in talking about narratives,
Sure.
you know, who's getting it right?
Who's getting it's hard to get it all right because I think once you start to look into food systems, you discover that they are so complex. They have so many levels, right? You need to talk on the level of politics, economics, sociology, anthropology. Then, of course, there's the whole scientific realm about diet, ecosystems, all of these things. So to get it all right would be very, very difficult. But, you know, the people that you mentioned, you know, Michael Pollan is very good on this. Barbara Kingsolver's book is very good on this. Food, Inc. is also a valuable film to watch. There are others. Fresh is another film that I think is valuable. Marion Nessel has talked about this in some of her books, the political dimension of this and how that relates to diet. She's very good. Wendell Berry's a good writer to go to understand the larger agricultural and cultural issues surrounding the way we eat and grow our food. So there are plenty of good writers out there now to go read, and I'd encourage people to do that.
Good. This is Office Hours at Duke University. Professor Norman Wirzba is talking about food and faith. You're invited to participate in the conversation by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook. Professor Wirzba, I want to make sure that we speak about your book, The Gift of Creation, a fairly recent collaboration with the photographer Thomas Barnes, and we actually have some images from this. So let's go ahead and look at these photographs from Thomas Barnes in The Gift of Creation. But your role in this was as an editor, compiling essays that speak to environment and theology, faith. What did you learn? You worked with scientists, you worked with Jewish theologians, Christian theologians, a photographer. What was your takeaway from this?
I think one of the very important things is that this project allowed this aesthetic dimension to come up. And there was a question earlier about how aesthetics plays a role in this. And I think that's very important. And here we have to address, I think, how we live in a world that really insulates us from so much of what's going on around us. We don't understand that, you know, to have the cheap oil that we have, relatively cheap, I suppose, you know, we've got Oil Valley or Alley going down through New Orleans, and we can see the kind of blight on the landscape that is. Or when we think about our electricity, where does it come from? And then you start to realize, oh my, all through West Virginia and eastern Kentucky and Tennessee, whole mountains are being blown away so that we can access the coal more cheaply. And it's truly ugly, right? It's a scar on the landscape. And so I think if we're going to talk about healthy food, if we're going to talk about honoring and caring for God's creation, to have images that let us see exactly what's happening is very valuable. Because when you're living in a suburban world, like many of us do, it's very hard to get out to know what's happening, right? You might drive down an interstate and you'll see woods, but you don't realize that 100 yards past those woods there's a clear cut that's happened. But you know, we don't want to see some of these things. We're not encouraged to see. And so this was a book that was helpful because it allowed me to bring together with Tom these images so that we could start talking about the aesthetics of creation, because that's certainly something that's important even from a scriptural point of view, because most people who know the first creation story in Genesis 1 should be aware that after doing the various things that God does, God punctuates it by saying, and this is good, this is beautiful. So I think that's a dimension that's really important to recover. And it's not something that only Christians talk about. I mean, Jews can talk about this too, because we share these scriptures.
And speaking of scripture, you know, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, creation in Genesis comes to mind. But interestingly, you think there's a lesson from Noah
Sure.
of building the ark fame. So what's Noah's lesson about food and
Yeah.
eating?
Well, I think one way to think about the Noah story is that, Noah saves a remnant of these animals
Right.
because there's going to be this flood, and that's really the extent of the story. Noah saving some animals so that when the flood's over, there'll be animals to repopulate the earth. And I'm taken by a Jewish rabbinic tradition that says that what's important about the ark is not simply that some animals are saved, but what's going on in the ark.
Right.
Right? And this is really important, and it connects to food, because what Noah had to do, taking this as a story, obviously, is that these animals are going to be in the ark for quite a length of time. So think of the preparation that Noah would have had to do this, right? Because there's all these animals. He's got to feed them.
Right.
And he's got to learn to take care of them. He needs to know what their need is. And one of the rabbis says at one point that this brought so much joy to Noah that during the entire months while on the ark, he never stopped to sleep.
Despite all the noise.
Right, because it's like when you're the host of a great party, you don't want it to end. And your delight comes from bringing delight to others. So when we learn that Noah is called the righteous one, that he's somehow like God, we discover that while Noah is being a host to these animals on the ark, he's showing us what God does with the whole creation all the time, which is to be the host of all these creatures made by God. And we don't tend to think about it this way, because we sometimes think that, God created the world and God is now absent. But in some theological writing, you discover that one of the ways to describe God's act of creativity is to say that God is being hospitable, which means that God is always making room, always nurturing what is not God to be and to flourish.
Professor Norman Wirzba, I wondered if you could close us out with, a favorite grace or scripture. I know you quote to Psalm 104, or if there's
Right.
a grace that you say at your family table.
Yeah, I mean, saying grace is a really wonderful thing, because it's hard to do, right? Because sometimes it just becomes a formula and you say it. But, if we say something like, bless this food to us, bless it to our bodies, and us to your service, which is one that we will often say in our house, we have to think about, well, what do we mean when we say that? Because to say bless it to our bodies, can you say that honestly if you know that the food that you're eating is bad for you? Right? And when we say bless our bodies to your service now, that brings in a political dimension where we now have to leave that table committed to being the kinds of people who honor God's creation. Right? So it's difficult. And to be mindful, I mean, another example that I like is that the Shakers had a tradition of being quiet for 2 minutes before you eat, because you need time to calm your mind and realize what you're about to do, that you're going to eat something that was once alive and is now no longer alive. It's been prepared and given to you so that you can live.
It's been death there.
Right.
Jeff wants to get in one more question before we go here.
All right.
And he says, can you please comment on the idea that gardening and generally increasing intimacy with food production can create a sense of gratitude and dispel this idea of entitlement, especially in regard to our food access? Jeff, who has spent time with farmers and ranchers of Seven Persons, Alberta. Okay.
Right. 7 persons. Oh, wonderful. Alberta. I love it. This is so important. One of the things that we as food consumers have forgotten is that food is a gift. When you're involved in growing food as a rancher or a farmer or a gardener, you realize very clearly that food is not something that you can control. Right? The life that makes your eating possible is a gift. It's a miracle, really. And the commodification of food has given rise to this superstition that Wendell Berry has described. And the superstition is that we believe money produces food, which of course is ridiculous. It doesn't produce food. Food comes out of the ground as this miracle. And being involved in food production yourself brings you face to face with it, right? Mouth to the reality. You have to see this and experience it. And then you begin to realize through your own stomach really how much you live by the generosity and grace of a power that we describe as God. And this is so important to recover, because unless we learn to become grateful in our eating, we're not going to learn to be very generous with others. And I know one of the jokes, of course, when you have people who are gardeners, that they start showing up at your door with all this zucchini because it's just growing like crazy. But to be in a garden or to be on a farm is to realize that you're always the beneficiary of gifts. And it doesn't guarantee that you will become a more generous person, but it certainly helps.
Mm-hmm. Professor Norman Wirzba, thank you for holding online office hours and answering everybody's questions.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Norman Wirzba is at Duke's Divinity School. He is the editor of The Gift of Creation, Images from Scripture and Earth, with his collaborator Thomas Barnes. The book is available on campus here at the Cokesbury Bookstore. His forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press is Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating. A recording of this office hours session will be available on the Duke On Demand website, where you can find many other Duke videos as well.
Watch Duke
On Demand.
ondemand.duke.edu.
This week on Duke On Demand, Duke alumnus Shane Battier talks basketball, education, and more in a Duke Idea conversation with President Richard Broadhead.
You hear about the graduation rates now, and you hear about it's appalling, really, especially with African-American athletes in college in basketball and football. But there are a lot of athletes who want to get education, who want to have the college experience, who want to do well in their sports, who want to do well in school. But that message gets lost in the statistic.
Also this week, Duke doctors give expert information on sinuses, allergies, cholesterol, and other areas of medicine in the Healthy Focus series.
And thoughts on innovation and entrepreneurship from the CEO of the New York Stock Exchange.
ondemand.duke.edu.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.